That is my usual. Hello, everyone. My name is Ochumare. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the youth program officer and co-founder of Black Lives Matter New Haven. Thank you so much for joining us today for this discussion, exploring Black queer history with C. Riley Snorton and Darius Bost. My name, again, is Ala. Before we start today, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are on. The New Haven Pride Center was founded and operates on the traditional lands of the Mohegan, the Mashantucket Pequot, the Eastern Pequot, the Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Pagasaut, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac peoples. We hope that from wherever you are, you take a moment to acknowledge and honor the Native people whose land you occupy and the history of the place you are in. Find out more about Native lands at native-land.ca. So again, thank you so much for joining us. This conversation is going to be amazing today. I'd like to introduce the two folks that are joining us today. I want to first bring up C. Riley Snorton. Hello. And our second person who is joining us today, Darius Bost.
Hello.
I could introduce you, but would you mind just sharing your names, your pronouns, and something very short about yourself? I'm going to throw it to whomever wants to go first.
Sure. My name is C. Riley Snorton. My pronouns are he, him, and they, and them. I am a professor of English and Gender Sexuality Studies, and I'm also the interim director for the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture at the University of Chicago.
Hi, everyone. I'm Darius Bost. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm an associate professor of ethnic studies in the School for Cultural and Social Transformation at the University of Utah.
Wow, y'all are amazing. So let's just get into it. We don't have that much long, although I could talk to you for about 4 to 5 hours or days. I tried my hardest to really get the questions down. So let's just jump right into it. Why does Queer America try its hardest to hide the Blackness of queer history?
Do you want to start?
Oh, yeah, I was going to say, I struggle with picking on people like, answer the question.
Well, I guess I can start on this one. I don't know if I would necessarily use the term hide. I do think that historians do a better job than most sort of queer theorists around sort of questions of race. But I would say that I think that they fail to take it up, mostly because it would require them to transform, right, their very practices. Not only would it transform the narrative, the historical narrative, and the conclusions they draw, but the methods, right? So I'm thinking about the work of queer Latinx theorists, Jose Munoz and Rob Hernandez, who've talked about how the archival practices of queers of color, because they, are often multiply marginalized, are usually randomly organized and don't meet up to the sort of terms of official history or evidentiary authority. And so some of the very foundational tenets of the field of history would have to be revised to do the work of Black queer history. And so I think that's why, I'm excited that you invited us here to, folks who are not trained as historians, who are, working through sort of queer and trans methods for approaching Black history. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Darius, that was such a wonderful, thoughtful way into that question. And, honestly, I'd only add a couple of things, which is really that so much of what it means to do Black, queer, and trans history, or to to narrate the lives of Black, queer, and trans people from the past has so much to do with a kind of complexity that makes the question of methods also a question about ethics. And so, I think that in some ways, this is just underscoring the point that you're making about what kinds of transformation we would have to demand and we would expect from the discipline or the field of history, for the kinds of figures, the kinds of narratives that you and I have been taking up in our work to become a more central component of how the discipline of history, and perhaps we should also implicate some other disciplines here,
Absolutely.
would proceed forward. Yeah.
Definitely. And so that actually kind of leads me directly into the next question. And I something that was very intriguing to me in the beginning of Black on Both Sides, and actually something that after I read that, I based like 5 conversations in my Black community with the work that we were doing with Black Lives Matter, New Haven. How does it feel to be a problem or the problem? And Du Bois asked that question, and it was reiterated in the book. And I thought it would be amazing to share that right now.
Definitely. Yeah. So, in part, when Du Bois raises the question, it's about getting into the experience of double consciousness. What does it mean to both understand oneself within a particular context, perhaps a kind of a context of familiarity or closeness in intra-racial context, and then how does it feel to be a problem at the level of the kind of broader social, the national, etc. So it's a question that also presumes that there can be an answer, which is no, as there is also a kind of resounding answer, which is yes, that you are the problem. And when I think about that question, I think it does in some ways map back to the kind of problem of complexity as it relates to kind of historiographic method, but also in terms of politics, that like so often, and I know that there's someone who said it this way, but I'm riffing and I can't remember the exact point of citation, but it's like, there's always the pursuit of the single or singular narrative. It's like, it's so much more digestible to kind of think about a politics around one form of oppressed identification. And so, I think that when the opportunity for us to all talk together is about, not only is it, what does it mean if queerness is the thorn in heteronormativity, but it's also like thinking about, Black embodiment in relation to kind of global structures of anti-Blackness. And it's also talking about, a kind of system of colonial gender that was built off of a kind of disinheritance of Blackness from certain forms of gender, normative gender positions. So we've already got at least 3 forms that we could add: class, and we could add nation, and we could add all kinds of things to that matrix. That, to me, is the kind of complexity of the problem that is also why I think Du Bois's formulation at the turn of the 20th century is so resounding. Here we are, in the kind of early to now approaching the first quarter of the 21st.
I wanted to sort of approach that question in a different kind of way, since this is, about Black queer history, and to think about as a Black queer historical figure, Augustus Granville Deal, who is a 1908 Harvard graduate. He was a sociologist and musician and a mentee of Du Bois. And he was an associate professor at Atlanta University, who moved to New York at Du Bois's request to work for the crisis. But, and I bring him up because he was one of the people who actually helped Du Bois to investigate this very question of what it feels like to be a problem. But yet Du Bois shunned him after he was arrested for homosexual activity in a public restroom. And I wanted to read a quote from Du Bois's autobiography. Said, quote, "I had before that time no conception of homosexuality and never understood the tragedy of an Oscar Wilde. I dismissed my coworker, Augustus Deal, forthwith and spent heavy days regretting my act," right? And like, I bring that up because even the sort of very question that still is relevant to us in terms of the ways that we're thinking about it in the 21st century, as Raleigh brought out in terms of like affect, right? Like what, how does it feel, right? To feel unlovable, to live under a structure of anti-Blackness that feels like disposability, and but also to think about that the sort of forms of disposability that happen within the terms of sort of Blackness in the way that we've organized them in heteropatriarchal ways. And so that very question, right, is rooted in sort of divisions around sexual desire, right, for someone who was really doing the work, right? And this continues to happen throughout the 20th century, right? That question of the color line is also sort of, there are structural antagonisms around gender and sexuality.
Yeah, that actually makes me want to jump to another question on the list, because so much of what you folks just said, just the double consciousness of not only being Black and like not fitting in when however your Blackness is, right, and then being queer, and then sometimes not even being queer enough for queer people, or not wanting to hit gender binaries that are like policing your body and policing your mind and your wellness in a way. It's like, where do I fit in? Well, what do I do? How, I'm too Black for these gay people. I'm too gay for these Black people. And then when, and even trying to find ourselves and like adding intersections. I'm not a trans body, but so many of the people I love are trans, and the complexities that they have to face that I have a privilege to have never even thought about and I have a bunch of intersections of oppression. So that double consciousness, it becomes like a quadruple consciousness, and sometimes, and then it's mollifying at some point to just like sit there and feel and try to feel about how do I fit in, what do I do. And realizing that that's violence. Like, sometimes, queer folks and Black folks don't even realize the violence that we face daily, because it's not someone hitting us or trying to murder us, but our very existence is steeped in violence. And so both of your collectives' works also seeks to name the violence of erasure of both our queerness and our Blackness. Why, and using a term from a book that I've read, why such the pervasive investment in whiteness, especially in our gay community? And then I will also add, the intersection of our Black community. Why? Why do you see it? I know that one is like a thing, like you gotta think it for a second, because it's like racism. That's the first thing I always get up.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's a sort of the way that folks talk about an investment in whiteness is an investment in property and an investment in ownership. And, I think we continue to see that in, the mantra sort of make America great again. And, when we ask the question, great for whom? Part of the reason why I think there is an investment in whiteness, or we might, say like liberalism, like rights seeking, extending rights to folks, and capitalism, is precisely because, people want that sort of, they're holding out for that promise, right, of normativity, right, of humanity. And I think this is, the case for Black people as well. And right, the problem is that, they ignore the folks who for whom like normativity is not really an option. And those kinds of investments in normativity and the sort of promise of social mobility that comes with it, are part of the American dream. Like we've been indoctrinated into that, these ideologies just like everyone else. And I think that, for in the gay community specifically, like I, use the context of marriage, right? Like marriage is, one of the sort of single rights that have now been guaranteed that sort of gay people fought for, right? But the problem or the reason why they sort of left out the Black, and I'm thinking here of the legal scholar Catherine Frank's work, right, is that, for Black people, marriage never did the work of making them respectable, right? Like they still are read as deviant, right? I mean, even we can sort of trace this discourse throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, right? Like, and so the reason they don't take up the sort of bodies that cannot move into the mainstream is because it's difficult work, right? It's work that would require them to not sort of embrace the sort of the scraps that they're given by the state, the nation state, and to sort of like work for freedom for a collective whole that is, for whom there is sort of incommensurability within that group, right? And so I think a lot of people, Black folks and, white gay communities, don't take up these sort of broader projects and they sort of think about bodies that are left out of the mainstream because that is the difficult work, right? And they are sort of still holding out, right, for the sort of like project of humanity and normativity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think this is just a riff on what Darius was just saying, but it's like representation is not the solution to structural change.
Mm-hmm.
And so frequently we see kind of being mobilized politically around certain kinds of representational issues, when in fact what it does is keep the structure intact.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the kind of question of whiteness and its linking to property precisely helps to kind of or to make that territory clear that, like, there are all kinds of ways that we've already seen that assimilation is not anti-racist, right? And so, these kinds of projects where non-solutions are offered up to the problem, and we kind of get we continue to cycle around the non-solution. I mean, they proliferate across various kinds of identifications and types of problems. But I think that I think, and I appreciate you bringing in Frank's work. This is also making me think about, one of the early questions that Kathy Cohen raised about the field of queer studies, which was like, is this really about mobilizing around people and their sexuality, or is this something that helps us to think about how sexuality helps to orient us towards a new mapping of power?
Right.
And so, this again is like, what is the kind of what are the kinds of solutions to the problems that we can attend to that I think require a different calculation of who we imagine to be in political solidarity with, but also what that solidarity and what success looks like as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that is something that pops up in a lot of all the work that that we do in the movement for Black Lives. We're coming up against this representation, like, hey, we have you folks here, and it's fixed because you're here. And then, I give pushback. Well, do you have someone like me there, or do you just have a Black body there? Because, we find that need, that incessant need to just make it for ourselves. And if I just make it, then my family's okay. And that's understandable for Black folks, right? Like our whole history is like, no one's going to make it. So I just have to, be rooted in myself. But that is something that is very much white culture, like this rooting of just individualism. And we know, like, our history does not, we have not survived what we have survived with individualism. It's just not a way. And something that I just thought about that I wish I would have been able to articulate in question is, well, what do, I say this all the time, like in Black movement work, we need the Black folks first. Like white folks, we need your money, we need your bodies, we need, because we need mass, but we need the Black community to get around what's happening with the unwellness that has shown up due to systemic oppression that is now like rooted in our behaviors. Like this is what we do. We need us to get it together before we can allow or even need or say that we need white folks to come into this space. And I think the same thing needs to happen in our Black queer community, but as historians, so that means y'all have like views on the futures. I feel like most historians are also like futuristic people. What can you identify, or like, what do you think needs to happen within our Black queer community to get this work happening, this healing to really happen?
I mean, the work to me is a work around, decolonization, like giving up on some of the structures that we've internalized that have sort of prohibited us from sort of, loving ourselves, right? And loving others in the way. Like, I mean, I think about this, and I'm being sort of very sort of specific here, but I was watching this documentary on YouTube, and it was like a kind of guerrilla style documentary about like, it was sort of Black gay men talking about, are we the ones that we desire, right? And it was talking about sort of thinking about sort of how so much of our desire is caught up in sort of normative modes of masculinity, right? Sort of consumptive practices, right? And, to me, like, I think, a giving up of some of those, sort of trying to make ourselves sort of fit into these sort of normative structures is part of what has to happen for us to heal, and also a sort of reinvestment in sort of our collective survival. Like, I mean, even as you're suggesting about the family, we have to refuse the enclosure, right, of family. I mean, we see how the state exploits that. Like, I mean, just recently in Texas, when, the mayor was like, you need to take care of your own family and figure out how to heat your own house, right? Like, the family becomes this sort of site of privatization that the state can depend on. But, right, we've long had practices in Black communities that have refused those sort of modes of enclosure, and the sort of a mode of privacy that has really never been offered to us. So those are just some sort of reflections that I think about. But I do think that the fundamental work is a sort of work of decolonization and sort of like thinking outside the structures that we've been offered, and the ways in which we have sort of become intelligible and visible to each other and, to the state.
Yeah. I mean, I just also add there that part of the work of decolonization is kind of unthinking the coloniality of knowledge itself. So like one of the things that I'm constantly trying to think about is like, what would it mean to embrace something like uncertainty as a way of organizing myself in the world with others? So that like, so often I think it kind of starts from the project of like, we know ourselves and then we can know these communities. And I was like, well, what if we all actually kind of took a position of being like, I'm actually unsure. And what might come from the place of being less, putting less pressure on being secure about something, being right about something, i.e. what norms I think offer as a kind of quick solutions around some of these forms of difference that we have yet to really confront, encounter, and be transformed by. And but I just deeply resonate with what Darius's answer kind of offers. I think often I imagine like what it would be for like Black folks, Black queer folks, to move as like in a non-binary way, in a way that's about the both and, the neither nor, and all, and everything in between. That there doesn't have to be a kind of securing around a kind of what's being offered as a kind of binary opposed poles.
Yes.
And so, you know, it's like in some ways I'm just like, it would be beautiful for a kind of understanding of Blackness as non-binary, as you know, and this is to kind of quote Toni K. Bambara in a different sense, where she is responding to the masculinism of the Black arts movement. She says, let's move away from manhood and femininity into Blackhood. And I just keep thinking like what, you know, like what Black, queer, and trans folks might be able to model in this kind of deeply feminist formulation of what it means to live Black in the world.
That is beautiful. I have a new puppy who's attacking my feet right now. I apologize. That's why I'm looking down. He won't get out. That's actually so beautiful. Being able to be uncertain is something that's so hard for Black folks, because what we have always looked at as uncertainty has been unsafety and destitution in some form. And so changing what our definitions and like, and not reclaiming, but letting emergence become part of our everyday existence, but being cognizant of it, because like we are some emergent beings. We would have been decimated eons ago if not for the constant evolution and innovation of Blackness and what that means. And so to answer my own question, I've been reading, I'm a reader, so I've been reading Anarcho-Blackness and by Darius B. And the theme of just like the Black body itself is anarchy, and to live in your Blackness is anarchy. But what would it mean for the evolution or the innovation of Blackness, which we so desperately need, if we started to move with a Black trans narrative in everything that we did? And we don't have to be queer nor Black nor trans to do that, but just having that mind frame of including those folks actually is what liberation truly looks like for everyone. That simple statement is like what's stopping so much of the unification and like healing that I noticed that I just would love to see in the Black community, but knowing that that's exactly what we need. And that leads me to like my next question, which is like, you know, if gay is the new Black, right? Because I saw that so many times the last couple of years. I was like really plagued by it, trying to understand, but okay. So if gay is the new Black, like when is Black gonna be the new Black? When are we gonna get on? Holistically, and not just our culture and our bodies, but when is Blackness gonna get on?
Can you say like a bit more about like
when
like
is
gay is the new Black?
Yeah, like when is true? So the way that Blackness right now is coveted is through appropriation and turning us into property, turning us into per capita. And so that is like what's trending about us. But like, what does it take? How are we gonna know when like the holisticness of Blackness, like the Black trans woman who does not want to pass, who never wanted to pass, you know, when are we gonna know? Like I'm a person that's trying to live in transformation and emergence. And so like we live in trauma, we have perfected that. How do we, like, in that space of it? I'm so glad that you said that, Riley, because now I have it, like that space of uncertainty. What does that look like? What is that? I don't know. I just need someone else to say it.
I'll give kind of two thoughts that this question brings to mind. One is, the language of such and such as the new black is underscores how much blackness is used as a metaphor for any and everything. And so I hear your kind of first part. The first part of this question is really looking at the different ways that blackness becomes a metaphor for thinking either like interestingly a whole set of paradoxical things from resistance to non-ontology to like there's just so many things that
Mhm.
blackness gets to be the metaphor for. It's again being made use of like a kind of resource for something else. So it's a part of a kind of the very formulation gays the new black is a kind of formulation made possible by racial capitalism.
Mhm.
But then the other part of your question makes me think a little bit about, some of the thinkers that I'm really inspired by who I'm thinking about Denise Ferreira da Silva actually quite a bit. And one of the things that she argues is that we live in a world, but we also live in a plenum. And the plenum is the kind of state of everything, right?
Mhm.
And so we get so caught up in the idea of the world that we don't also remember that we can exist in all kinds of dimensions. So the kind of question about how do we wait for this black trans woman who doesn't have any desire to pass to live in a world where she feels, let's say, loved or supported? Like those are narratives that I was able to read about from the 1950s. I believe and affirm and hold space for that person to be in the present, but also it may be that her our knowledge of her existence doesn't happen in this world, but in the plenum. It's a space that we actually have to hold open. And so I'll just pause there because I think in many ways when we talk about the future, it for me there are some aspects of science fiction that I take somewhat literally, that I can imagine that we are living in different time registers, and that in fact that is part of why it's so interesting to work as a historian, because these kinds of events from the past are present for our future survival. But I'll pause there.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree. I think that part of the sort of work is the thinking about that. I believe it was Sean Crawley has talked about this, and many other people, but just to know that we need to pay attention to the other ways of being that already exist, right? And mentioning the sort of language of uncertainty, I go back to Melvin Dixon's diaries, and that's part of what I was writing about. Like he was, among many others who were facing an uncertain future in the face of AIDS, right? And yet, right, he drew on a kind of collective imagination, a diasporic imagination. And the work of other folks who came before him to still try to imagine a future and to imagine it otherwise, right? A future beyond these sort of structures, right? That continue to beset us. Like, I don't think that we can wait for this world to love us. I mean, like I think that we just have to continue to imagine and continue to build new worlds, right? And those worlds, right, are already sort of the paths for those worlds are already set, the maps, right, by folks that we've written about and that other folks have written about who have lived under these and beyond these oppressive structures, right? So that we can sort of imagine other ways of being.
Thank you for that. I'm gonna take a question from the audience. So for both Darius and Riley, are there any Black lesbian historical figures of the late 20th century and early 20th century who you think are essential for people to know about?
Yeah. Many, many, many. You want to?
You get started because I think I'll probably layer some trans and lesbian overlaps in history too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a sort of depending on like the work you want to do. I mean, the sort of uh, the very common term now, intersectionality, right, comes from Combahee River Collective, which is sort of a Black lesbian feminist organization. Um, I mean, I think it's essential to know figures like Cheryl Clark, poet and scholar and activist, and Barbara Smith, right, who is just done some phenomenal work. Who was a part of Combahee, and also it's the sort of work of Black lesbian feminists who created Kitchen Table, Woman of Color Press, right? I also think about sort of in the scholarly world, right? Sort of like Black lesbian feminists. I think about Kathy Cohen, who we've mentioned, Evelyn Hammonds, right, who did all this sort of important work on HIV and AIDS. Linda Villarosa, who's still doing that work, right? There are so many names to know from this period. I don't know what you want to add.
Yeah, no, I was also thinking, activist, founder of so many Black LGBT organizations across the 20th century, Mandy Carter. There's so
Mhm.
many, I was thinking actually too about figures who, for me, hold significance in like trans history and hold significance in lesbian history. And I think that they can exist in both. And so I was
Absolutely.
thinking about Pauli Murray,
Yes.
lawyer, priest, so many author
Mhm.
who the kind of there's a kind of critical discussion right now about whether or not we think of Pauli Murray as trans masc given some of their writings, or if we're thinking about Pauli Murray as a lesbian. I think these kinds of debates should not preclude us from really delving into everything that they've offered us as a figure. Um,
Absolutely.
I was also thinking about one of the figures in Black on Both Sides, who I call them McHarris Grant,
Yeah.
and that figure to me also lives in a lot of different trajectories of how they're named. It was my understanding that in the 70s and 80s, people would include images from that ebony spread as a kind of I think it was called the Butch slideshow, and so it was like kind of part of some of the work of lesbians at the late 20th century recovering earlier narratives. And so much of doing trans history is about being willing to sit alongside that like there are narratives that were have been important to lesbian and gay histories that are also important to trans histories.
I also just want to throw out, I mean, another queer figure who's more sort of mid 20th century, but Lorraine Hansberry, who
Sure.
I just think is so important. I mean, if you want to know someone whose work was about the practice of freedom, right? I think that looking at Lorraine Hansberry's work, the broad oeuvre of her work in her short life, I think is really important.
Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. And this isn't that just had me create a new research project for myself. I'm gonna go find names of um, Black and brown trans women and feminists that I don't know yet, because I'm sure that I'm citing their work and like standing on their shoulders and don't even know it. And yeah, and that actually leads me to the next question. Um, for both Riley and Darius, are you a Black queer feminist? Why or why not?
Um, I mean, yes, I would say that the way that I entered into this work and Black queer studies came from sort of Black, or I would say sort of Black feminists who were doing work around sexuality, Black queer. I don't think that was a term that was used at the time, but I'm thinking about sort of Barbara Smith's Toward a Black Feminist Criticism, and Deborah McDowell's reading of Nella Larson's Passing, a queer reading of that. Um, Akasha Gloria Hull's rereading of the Harlem Renaissance as queer. I enter this work through thinking about folks who were really disrupting the African American literary canon, right? By having us think about gender and sexuality as critical sort of analytics, right, for rethinking those fields. And in terms of politics, absolutely, because, right, one of the things that Kathy Cohen says a lot, and part of the reason that I wrote my book is she talks about how often in the historiography we jump from the civil rights movement to Black Lives Matter without missing the sort of feminist and queer and lesbian work that went on in between it to help us get there to this sort of queer feminist led movement that was invested in people who are on the margins of the margins, right? And so that did not come about. These sort of the politics of Black Lives Matter in terms of like rejecting narratives of respectability and innocent victimhood, right, are a direct, right, response, or they come out of the work that was done in this interim period. And it was work that was sort of interested in sort of the overlapping structures of oppression and the connectedness of sort of oppressions, right? Like thinking about violence, right, and as a Black feminist issue, right? So yes, in terms of the ways that I think about my work, like I feel like I am, want to be accountable to the work that made mine possible, and also just accountable in the way that you all are talking about the bodies that are emerging and yet to emerge, right? And so, right, sort of that includes trans studies, but it also includes sort of disability studies, and it includes all those sort of fields of knowledge that are about questioning sort of norms and normativity.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, I don't have much to add in terms of how Darius laid that out. I'll just also say, yes, I identify as a Black queer feminist, and I think the most sincere and succinct way of saying is that like I wouldn't actually know how to do any of the work that I do without that kind of grounding. And so, I feel like the names that Darius raised absolutely have those, like that's deeply resonant for me. And I also just think that like in addition to how it is that I was, how I came into what it means to be an academic, but also how I came into my own kind of political orientations and philosophies are deeply about being both in the study of and in the collectivities of Black queer feminisms. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
This is the Black queer feminism is a conversation that we've been having at the Pride Center now for almost a year, with me leading it, specifically because for me, when I started excelling as an organizer in the movement for Black lives is when my work truly became intersectional in every way. Queer stuff, education stuff, movement for Black lives, policy change. Now I'm adding the intersection of COVID education and Blackifying COVID education. And to truly understand Blackness and like queerness, I needed to become a Black feminist. I did not know Black feminism. I did not know I was reading Audre Lorde, reading Black feminism work. I just thought that I was reading a queer Black woman and that she sounded like all the Black women that I grew up around. So it a separation. But feminism was very white for me. And I was like, oh no, they want to be white men. We don't. So I really struggled with the term. And then I found out about what queer Black feminism is, and that it's a difference. And that was like a beautiful thing and a beautiful understanding, and allowed me to hold the front lines different. Like when we have actions with Black Lives Matter New Haven, if you look at our front line, we have people in wheelchairs, old folks, young folks, white folks, black folks, and you got to hold the line, and it's not about that. We have to move at the pace of everyone. We have to include them on the front line. So we'll move at so everyone's on the right pace. And I didn't understand that. I think that's something that is left out of feminism sometimes, the ableist part of the world, and how deeply that is connected to racism and patriarchy. And folks just, due to racism and patriarchy, the disconnect is so strong that folks don't always see it. So thank you for that. And it's always important for me to show that Black queer feminists don't just look like cishet Black women, that we look like what true Black queer feminism is, and it's a diaspora of Blackness. Yeah. And we have another question from the audience, and I want to pivot after this, so I thought it was important. How can we fight erasure in academia?
My initial response is that I'm not fighting, academia. I'm doing my work, right? I just keep thinking about it, and I'm paraphrasing, Morrison, right? All of that is a distraction, right? And especially now, right, when, I think it's a sort of, it's misguided to separate sort of what's happening in the academy from what's happening sort of politically, right? And, my sense is that, right, in the same way there's a doubling down around sort of whiteness in the sort of, in the United States, there's also a doubling down with it in the academy, and this sort of myth of that it's this sort of left structure that's doing this sort of radical education is really not true. And so, for me, it's just a matter of like, what sort of capacious methods, right? What are my methodologies, right? Who am I listening to, right, outside of the academy, right? Who is doing the work, right? I am, when I was writing this book, I was living in San Francisco, and I was just paying attention to everything. I was just so heartened by the work that the movement for Black Lives was doing, right? Because I understood the work that I was doing was as an earlier instantiation of that movement, right? And it was sort of helped to instruct the way that I was thinking in my work. And so, and I'm also sort of encouraged by, right, the sort of work of Black queer feminists who have always unsettled those boundaries between the academy, right, and community-based knowledge, right, and who see their training as just a starting point, right, for the work that they're doing. So, yeah, like I think that, my answer to that question is really fighting that is not really, it's just a distraction from your work.
I will also just throw in two kind of practical responses to that question as well, which is like, part of it is also not being complicit with the structures of erasure in your citations, right? There's a reason why there's a hashtag cite Black women. And there's also, I think we need to think about, especially in the realm of queer history, queer theory, citing Black people and citing Black people well. So that's one kind of practical response. I think the other one is one that I hear, especially now as someone who sits as a full professor, which means building pipelines. Like there's a mandate for me, right? That like, I don't want to be even if I might be the first Black trans full professor in the U.S. Academy, I don't want to be the last. And so what does it mean to like fight erasures? In part, what does it mean to make sure that those pipelines remain open so that it doesn't have to be fixed on me as a singular figure, but rather that we think about these as huge fields of inquiry with lively debate, which is what it is, right? And I feel also a kind of the necessity to say that like I am not the only person, thinking these questions, and that's not only in terms of like what Darius and I think together, but also the generations of scholars who made it possible, and the generations and the current generation that I sit in. And so it's a way of also not making any claims to exceptionalism, even, and that happens in citation, and that also happens in terms of the labor of keeping the pipelines open.
Yeah, and I also think that is a problem for the majority too, right? Like, I mean, they have to do that work as well. It's a lot of that onus and responsibility continues to be on us, and they have to teach anti-racism. They have to teach, right, anti-colonialism. So,
Yes, thank you. And to wrap up, I want to leave on a note of Black joy. That is my commitment for the next however long the ancestors bless me on this earth. To create Black joy and make sure that we end on Black joy as much as possible. So I ask you, how do you live in your Black joy?
That's a hard question to answer right now because I feel like I'm in a constant state of mourning. I mean, we just crossed the threshold of losing, 500 million people, and, injustice, in our community is accumulating. I mean, the joy I have continues to be that, to know that, people are still doing the work, right? That, and also, like, I can say that I have found joy, particularly, over this year, in sort of creativity, and collaboration. I've been in this long-term collaborative relationship with Black lesbian filmmaker Cheryl Dunye, and I've been working with her on developing a pilot that's an adaptation of her film. And it's, taken me out of the genre that I normally write in. And also just getting to work with her, and that has brought me a lot of joy, right, to sort of think about creativity and the imagination, and again, to sort of go back to the discussion we were having earlier, right, like to use the work that I'm doing in whatever form to imagine otherwise.
For me, I mean, the kind of piece about what is it you're living in and with grief, and to be asked the question about joy, it makes me think a lot about like what I try to do is like kind of cultivating practices of gratitude, because for me that's also always about being in a particular moment to be able to witness that there's something alongside grief that is there, that it can be present with others. And to I think of gratitude as a kind of practice of pulling you out of yourself, because I think so often grief often is about a kind of folding inward. And so I think of those as kind of practices in tandem with one another that kind of get to something like a sense of joyfulness, or just a kind of recognition of like, oh, like this has been, like this conversation has been a moment where we've touched and agreed, that like that to me is very beautiful. And gives a sense beyond either the like the bureaucratic drone, or the like, kind of moment that we're in of pandemic inside of epidemic inside of pandemic inside of epidemic.
Yes.
So that's the practice that I think which allows me to connect with joy at different moments, including this
Yeah,
one.
I would. Well, same, both Darius and Riley. I actually been living in grief for the last couple of weeks, and but I have become a commitment to creating Black liberated spaces. So I started doing stuff like finding gratitude and like being okay with being like this giddy, like how I got in the thing with y'all. Like I was fainting when Patrick brought this to me, and that actually has pockets of grief. Had this anticipation of this let me be like, you know what? that's fine. You about to be black and gay and happy and, you know, on Monday, and finding joy in that and the gratitude, and
Right.
also being okay with knowing that I can't, it's imbalanced to think that we're always going to be these happy, joyous
Absolutely.
people. But our innovation and resistance has been constantly finding joy in spaces that there doesn't readily look like there's joy. So I want to close out with saying thank you again so much. And the joy I find in COVID is being allowed to be in spaces with you two beautiful humans. Thank you for the work that you have given back, not only to academia, but for Black folks, for queer folks, for trans folks. I've taken the names of folks that you both have shared in your book and shared it with the young people that I work with the young trans Black and brown people that I work with, and that has been sometimes the moment of healing, that everything else that I've tried to do didn't work, but they have a name of an ancestor that, and the struggle that you share, their erasure, their reclaiming was something that has touched young people in a way that has been so beautiful. And so thank you so much for your sacrifice, and thank you so much for the work that y'all do and the joy that y'all bring. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We're going to take these last couple of minutes and ask you both to plug whatever it is that you need to plug, and make sure that we get connected to it. Darius, I'm going to throw you in first because I started with Riley.
I just want to say thank you for cultivating this space, and thank you for, saying those words to know that that people are that the work is meaningful, right? That matters to me, and that's sort of helps me to keep going. And I also just responding to the sort of the previous question, just like, remembering the sort of question of our ancestors, right? That was what sustained me in writing this work, that it was something to be done. And so we cannot, leave our dead behind us, right? Whether they're physically or civically, socially, right? And, so thank you.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I feel so moved that the work, when it is useful, is useful. I feel really grateful to be in the conversation with you both, and also with Brandon, and with this audience on Facebook and YouTube. I hope that this can just be the beginning of a whole series of conversations among us. And, I'm on social media, so readily findable to continue the conversation.
I am going to stalk y'all social media. Thank you so much, Brandon. And thank you so much, Riley and Darius. And thank you so much, audience. And join us again.
Right.